Hello, this is your host of PoliTalks, Eric Hacopian, and we are pleased to have as our guest today Armen Harutyunyan. Mr. Harutyunyan is an economist who served as Deputy Minister of Agriculture in Armenia from 2013 to 2018, as a lecturer at the Agricultural Educational Center from 2012 to 2014, and at the Yerevan State Medical University since 2018. Armen Harutyunyan is an expert in behavioral economics and service platform development. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You're an expert on the agricultural sector of the economy, and you left the ministry. What have you been working on in the last, what are you working on currently?
After leaving the ministry, basically the first initiative was an interesting project in terms of the new digital technologies, and particularly it was the platform, an application that helps people to forecast crypto markets. But it was a very kind of a short-term project that we tried to address with some colleagues from Kazakhstan. But later I joined the United Nations and the Resident Coordinator's Office in particular. And basically I'm working in charge of the coordination, partnership and development finance now.
You know, there was always a lot of focus on the more attractive parts of the economy that people like to talk about, tech, tourism, things of that nature. Agriculture, however, employs by far more people than on these other sectors, and is the least talked about. What can you tell us about the agricultural sector, its size, how many people it employs, and its impact on the economy? Because this is not a topic that people know a lot about.
In my opinion, agriculture has a great potential for development in Armenia, and I'm sure it's one of the most important sectors from many different perspectives. At first, let's look at the international developments, and particularly global markets. At first, you have a growing population, and therefore the demand for the food in the global value chains would be growing. And at the same time, you have the interesting change in the preferences and behavior of the consumers. So when you look at the more developed countries, and in particular European countries and some other Western states, you see a more kind of a dynamics toward a healthy lifestyle. And therefore, high-value agriculture can play an important role. And particularly, of course, organic agriculture development has a great potential to address those market developments, because the growth in terms of the organic food has been much kind of larger than the conventional food, and therefore there is a great potential for that. At the same time, you have other developments with the rise of the middle income in many different parts of the world, but in particular in China, India, and some parts of the Africa, also boosting the production in the meats and other, I would say, higher value foods at the moment. And therefore there is a very good global dynamics that demonstrate that agriculture all around the world has a great potential. In terms of the Armenia, of course, we have around 317,000 people engaged in the agriculture. Most of the rural populations are engaged in agriculture activities, and we're facing basically two challenges. At first, it's a productivity in the agriculture sector that, by the way, can be resolved through the introduction of the newest technologies in the sector. But on the other hand, also the need for transformation for the high-value agriculture, which I think has a great potential, having in mind that we have a limited natural resources.
I wasn't going to ask this question, but you brought up the issue of organics, which is something that's talked about every kitchen table here, or in many. How reliable, I mean, what are the certification systems? Are these systems international? Are they Armenia-based? And are they frankly reliable? Or is, even in the United States or in the West, there's a lot of people who put organic on something when it actually isn't organic? What is that? Do we have systems in place that can assure people that this is GMO-free or organic? Or is it just everybody on his own, or is it industry-based?
Well, I would say we have a pretty good legislation on organic agriculture, but we've been working on improving that legislation and approximating that legislation to the best international practices, and particularly some regulations by IFOAM that states the basic rules for the organic agriculture practices.
What does that stand for?
IFOAM, International Federation of Organic Agriculture. And basically, but other than that, of course, we have the local legislation, which have some certain requirements over the organic production, certification, and stuff like that. But most importantly, we have the local organization. Unfortunately, it's only one, But this local organization is accredited by the European institutions and USDA NOP. So the certification provided by that organization is basically considered international.
So you would consider it reliable?
I would consider it reliable. Okay. And actually the story behind the reliability is also the limited number of the producers. So it's relevant in terms of this kind of a scale of the operations and easiness of the monitoring of the activities. As the scale would grow up, I'm sure there would be new players on the market, but at least at the moment we're providing certification in Armenia for the local production, for the regional production. There is a kind of a Green Caucasus initiative, but of course those organizations that are interested to export their products to Europe and the United States, they can receive respective certification in Armenia.
I know your personal views on agriculture development don't come out of the sort of the traditional can of World Bank, IMF, and institutions like that. There's essentially two models. It's the sort of the large top-down model where you have less crops, monocrops. You focus entirely on exports. That there's one development, and then there's another one, which is sort of a completely what I call looking at the wisdom of the farmer. You know, as something as simple as seeds. You know, we've had farmers for thousands of years, many of them without any education, that have managed to create thousands of varieties of seeds around the world, and sort of, you know, protect the food basket of the world far better than what is run by the major agricultural companies now, where they've got everything down to 6 or 7 varieties, and that's 80% of what's grown. Which one do you prefer, and how does that play? How does that conflict between these two visions play in the agriculture development in Armenia?
Let me try to answer on this question in many different perspectives. At first, of course, in terms of the food security, I think the global developments have demonstrated that our natural resources are sufficient to feed people. And even when you look at the being an UN employee, of course, the Sustainable Development Goal 2, number 2, is about the food security and malnutrition. And I think having these newest technologies, modernization, automation, and agriculture sector has helped to feed global populations. And that's certainly a good process. But considering the size and the limited natural resources of Armenia, in my opinion, we should try to support all kinds of producers, but rather concentrate on the small and medium enterprises and the agriculture sector.
What does that mean in specific crops areas? That must mean something in specific crops. Is it fruits? Or is it, what is it?
You know, there is obviously a low value agriculture products and a high value agriculture products. If you don't have the massive land and massive natural resources, you wouldn't be competitive on the global markets with this low value
soybeans
products.
And corn.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But if you concentrate on such products, we've seen a very interesting developments recently in Armenia. People are trying to produce asparagus, people are trying to produce quinoa and other varieties that have the higher value and the growing global demand for such type of the products. I think this is important to consider. But on the other hand, I think it's also very much interesting to see the synergy between tourism and hospitality sector and the agriculture sector. Because as we go with an alternative tourism, rural tourism, ecotourism activities, that brings a lot of people to the rural communities, to the regions of Armenia. And therefore the tourism industry itself can boost agriculture sector and create an interesting value chain that covers tourism and agriculture sector.
You brought up exceptionally interesting ideas, but you must know certain, who are the people that stand out? There must be some examples of this. Who are the people who stand out that are doing interesting things, as you just described, that meld these two worlds or go after high value agriculture? Who's doing interesting work on that you can show as an example or you can talk about?
You know, there are many examples in Armenia. We have a very interesting dried food production in Yervandashat community, which has grown from very, very small producer to a producer that sells its product now in the duty-free stores and the high-value supermarkets in Russian Federation, for example.
What is it called, you said?
It's, let me remember the name. Initially, it was Volodya Khachikian Limited Liability Company, but I'm not sure. I don't remember the name at the moment. We have the Davtyan farm, which is concentrating in Sunak region on asparagus production. We have another farm in Armavir region, which is extending its production in terms of the asparagus. A few years ago, we didn't have any production of broccoli in Armenia. Today, we have more than 100 producers, small and medium-sized producers that fully supply the local market during the season. In other words, in order to promote high-value agriculture in Armenia, of course, you have to have a strong link between extension, education, research, and the ministry. And I think we are doing a pretty good job at the moment in terms of the linking these capacities, because the most important thing for the farmers in Armenia, and in particular for the small farmers, is a knowledge. And this knowledge transfer is really, really important. But at the same time, there are also institutions, international development organizations, but also local organizations that are doing a very good job in terms of the conveying this knowledge from the more developed countries to our developing kind of a rural sector.
These sectors or these companies that you mentioned, how much of their product is geared towards export? Because I'm going to follow up. There's a sector of the economy that people don't know a lot about, which is literally, planes every morning are filled with tomatoes and half a dozen different things. Then they ship off to the Gulf countries, Qatar, the UAE. How much of this kind of higher value production is geared towards export? Who owns and who profits from these systems, and how much is this the small farmer that benefits, or is it the big people with the hot houses that go on for kilometers? Who's in this market and who's benefiting from it?
There are large organizations that have their production capacities. In particular, during the last few years, we have seen a dynamic growth in the intensive orchard establishment and the greenhouses, modern greenhouses. But on the other hand, when you look at the high value is mostly concentrated with the small and medium farmers. And then we have some kind of a middleman that are trying to bring this production together and export it to the different markets. But most importantly, we should consider many benefits that Armenia has at the moment, but probably is not sufficiently utilizing that opportunities. That's Armenia being a member country of the Eurasian Economic Union, which basically provides you a unique opportunity to export your products without custom tariffs or any type of the quota limitations. But on the other hand, we have a GSP Plus regime with the European Union, and GSP regime with Canada, United States, Japan, and some other states. In other words, in this particular case, for agricultural product, we should concentrate on the non-tariff regulation and the barriers. And this is certainly one area where United Nations has been helping Armenia. For example, very recently in Switzerland, it was a UNEC organized workshop. They have been working in Armenia for 2 years to identify that barriers that we face that actually limit our opportunities of penetrating new markets. For example, if you take an animal origin products, you have only permission to export 2 products to the European Union. That's a honey and crayfish. And you have to build these laboratory facilities, accreditation of the laboratories, and many other things. And if we would manage, and I've seen that there is a pretty good work done in that direction by the government at the moment, if we would manage to jointly improve that non-tariff regulations and remove that barriers, then Armenian agriculture producers can access these high-value markets.
Well, there's always been an issue of, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the agriculture industry became far greater percentage of GDP than normal. And there's many people who say we have far too many people in that sector, that the sector is inefficient, that you're actually better off having some of those people move into urban areas where there's far more employment available. To what extent are people who are saying that correct? And to what extent should we be focused on, there are models in agriculture that where you grow crops that actually employ a lot more people. If you're growing wheat, you don't employ that many people. You're growing artichokes or asparagus, you have a lot more people that are needed to do the work. Which model do you think is best, or do we need to choose between the two?
In general, if you look at the very interesting research done by McKinsey quarterly
company,
report, the two sectors that are more prone to this technological automation, digitization processes is in agriculture, textile, and some others. But agriculture is number one in terms of the introduction of the newest possible technologies, which indeed reduces the number of people, human capital in the agriculture sector. I believe that we should gradually go into that direction. In other words, let's take an example of the precision agriculture. I had a chance to moderate a session on big data in agriculture during the Green Week event in Berlin. That's a kind of a Davos in agriculture where a lot of new things are discussed. And it was really interesting how you can manage sensors, drones, satellite information to provide to the land exact amount of fertilizer and other inputs to ensure that you have the high productivity and at the same time high quality. So we would need to manage to have that transformation on the ground. And it would naturally bring some people outside of the agriculture and keep some others to extend their operations, extend their lands, etc., etc. But this should be a very much natural process. And considering the agenda of the government in terms of the inclusive economic development, then I assume that as other sectors of the economy would be growing, as their contribution to GDP would be growing, then this natural process would result in involvement of some rural population in other activities in the economy. But still, at the end of the day, there is no specific calculation. What is the exact number of people that we should have having in mind our natural resources? But when you look at the example of the Austria, Switzerland, New Zealand, and some other states, you still have a great capacity of having the small farmers, small farming, which would supply markets with the, I would say, traditional foods, which in many cases is different in terms of the taste and different in terms of the preparation of the meals. That's why many tourists when visiting Armenia, they see one of the things that they like is the food in Armenia, right? And I think we shouldn't lose that kind of a very big treasure of having the small farming available, but small farming that can produce a sufficient amount of the food to provide a better livelihood in the communities.
I'm going to close with this, sort of the biggest and probably the hardest question. One of the things is when I was reading about the reforming of the China that we have today started reforming its country and economy in the late 70s, early 80s. And it started by raising rural incomes, which it's the first thing that they did. And just to put things in perspective, I was reading in 1979, the income of the average Chinese farmer was $40 a year, not a month, a year. And you see what China is today. Obviously, these two countries are not analogous in any way. However, if you have a magic wand of raising rural incomes, which can dramatically change the country and the way people live and their approach to things, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would need to do to raise rural incomes in Armenia?
Basically, we have that formula. Maybe it's a bit more than 2 or 3 tools, but a formula 3 times 6. Basically, the 3 objectives of the agriculture sector is obviously the food security and food safety, productivity and high-value agriculture, and also the use of the natural resources so the next generations can benefit from them. And a toolkit composed of the 6 tools. That's a physical infrastructure, human capital development, introduction of the new technologies, risk management in the agriculture, institutional and governance-related issues. If you ask me to choose 3 that would contribute to the development, which would respectively bring to the increase of the rural population's income, that would be the human capital development, physical infrastructure, and probably risk management.
Well, I mean, infrastructure is easier to imagine what it is, what it is. What does human capital mean? Is it education?
It's the most important component, and I would break down it to the 4 components. Number 1 is education, and in my opinion, most importantly, vocational education. Number 2 is the extension, because whatever is produced in the university has to be delivered to the farmers. And extension or advisory services are the best known way now to transform that knowledge from academia to the farmers. Of course, there is other means, such as private organizations working and transferring their technology if a farmer buys some equipment or inputs. The third component is the research institutions, because Armenia should not be the country that only buys technologies from abroad, but we should have the capacity to produce some technologies. I'm not talking about some sophisticated, say, greenhouse infrastructure that we can develop in Armenia, but say we have a very great Armenian varieties of fruits and vegetables, and if we do a great work in terms of this, improving, making them more transportable. For example, we have the variety of tomato, Anahit. We should improve that variety. And this is a kind of the things that I believe research, vocational education, extension services, and also facilitation by the government in terms of the supporting these institutions with the right and proper regulation.
Well, Mr. Harutyunyan, it was a pleasure having you on our show, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting.